The prairie woke in silence, as it always did, the first light spilling over the horizon in a slow, gold spill that touched the tall grass until it glowed like old coins. The wind came early, soft at first, like the breath of something ancient that had never stopped breathing since the beginning of time. Out where the land ran so far you couldn't see the end of it, a lone rider moved through the grass, his shadow long and thin against the earth. He'd been out there every morning for as long as he could remember, mending a fence post or checking the cattle. Life had narrowed itself to these simple loops: work, eat, sleep, repeat, until the days blurred and the seasons slipped past without much notice. Some mornings he would wake and wonder what year it was, not because his memory failed him, but because it didn't much matter anymore. The dog trailed behind, a big, rangy mutt with a coat the color of dust, and eyes always half watching his master. Sometimes the man spoke to him, quiet words that didn't need answering. The sound of his own voice felt strange after hours of nothing but hoofbeats and wind. Once, there had been voices in this place, laughter carried in from the porch, the creak of a rocking chair, the soft footstep of someone moving inside the cabin. Those days were gone now, taken by a loss that had come like a storm, fast and loud, and left only quiet in its wake. He'd stopped counting how many years ago it had been. Counting didn't help. The world beyond his fences was changing. Even out here, far from the towns, he could feel it. Now and then, he'd find boot tracks near the creek, not his own. Once, he'd come across the faint remains of a campfire, cold and ringed with black stones. And sometimes, if the wind carried just right, he could smell smoke from far away, settler smoke or Comanche fires. He didn't know which, and he didn't ask. It was enough to know that peace between the two was as fragile as a dry twig. One step wrong, and it could snap. It was on one of those still, bright mornings that he saw them. 7 figures standing at the far fence line, their outlines wavering in the heat that was already starting to rise from the earth. He slowed his horse, the dog pricking up its ears. As he drew closer, the shapes sharpened into girls, Comanche girls, young enough that their shoulders still carried the narrow slope of childhood, but old enough to bear the weight of travel. Dust clung to their skirts and leggings, their braids loose and frayed from wind. None of them spoke. They just stood there, watching him, the way the wild watches a man, calm, but ready to vanish if he made the wrong move. The only sound was the steady creak of saddle leather as he eased closer. When he stopped, the oldest of them stepped forward. Her face was carved with exhaustion, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that made him hesitate. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She just lifted her arm and pointed toward his barn. He felt the weight of the moment press on him like a heavy coat. The barn meant shelter. Shelter meant he was taking them in. And taking them in meant, what? That their people might come looking? That someone, settler or Comanche, might think he'd stolen them? There was no clean way out of this. His gaze drifted over the prairie. It seemed even quieter than before. The sky was a hard, sharp blue, the kind that made sound feel smaller. The dog sat beside his horse, head cocked, as if waiting for him to decide which way the wind would blow. He looked back at the girls. They didn't wear fear in their eyes, though maybe they should have. What he saw instead was something else, something older, something that refused to bend. Dignity. The kind of person has when they've lost too much to ask for more, but they stand anyway. He swung down from the saddle. The dust rose around his boots as he walked past them toward the barn. The big doors groaned as he pulled them open. He didn't say a word, but stepped aside. One by one, they passed him, their skirts brushing the air between them. The youngest, no more than 9, glanced up at him once, quick as a bird, then hurried in after the others. By the time the doors shut, the sun was higher, and the morning had warmed. He leaned against the barn wall, listening to the quiet inside. There was a rustle of movement, a low murmur between them, the faint clink of a tin cup against the floor. He stayed outside a while, not ready to go in, not ready to break whatever it was they'd brought with them. The dog lay at his feet, watching the barn as if guarding it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The prairie air was cold, the stars sharp above him. But even inside the cabin, the restlessness stayed. He lay in bed, the old quilt heavy over him, staring at the ceiling while the wind threaded its way through the cracks in the eaves. He could hear them in the barn, just the soft rhythm of their breathing, 7 breaths rising and falling in unison, as steady as the tide. And he wondered what storm he had just let through his door. The mornings turned colder, the kind of cold that sharpened the air until it felt like glass against the skin. Winter lights spilled low and thin across the prairie, filling the barn with a pale glow. The girls were already awake, kneeling in a loose circle on the floor, bone needles in their hands, mending the hems of skirts or patching worn leggings. They worked in silence, the only sound the soft rip of thread sliding through cloth. He stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, a dented coffee tin warming his fingers. Steam curled up into the air and drifted toward them. They didn't look at him directly, but he could feel their awareness of him, the way wild animals feel the presence of another living thing. Words between them were rare. What he knew of their language wouldn't have filled a saddlebag, and he doubted they had much more of his. So they built something else instead, an unspoken way of talking through small actions and shared work. That first week, he showed them how to feed the animals, scattering hay in even piles so the horses wouldn't fight. One of the older girls watched closely, her eyes narrowing in thought, and the next morning she took over the task without being asked. In return, they showed him how to twist and braid rope so tight it could pull a fence post straight without fraying. The pattern was different from what he knew, more like weaving than braiding. And when he tried it, his fingers fumbled until the youngest laughed under her breath and took the rope from his hands to show him again. Meals became a quiet bridge between them. The first few nights, they ate separately, he at the table in his cabin, they in the barn with whatever food he left. But over time, they began to wander toward the cabin in the evenings, drawn by the smell of beans simmering or bread warming on the stove. Eventually, they began to sit with him at the rough wooden table. They didn't crowd close, but they didn't keep their distance either. The scrape of spoons on tin plates filled the silences, and sometimes the smallest of them would tilt her head, curious at the way he salted his food. Evenings by the fire became something else entirely. The dog would settle on the floor, chin on his paws, while the girls sat cross-legged near the hearth. They told stories with their hands, their voices low and musical, words rising and falling in a rhythm he didn't understand but somehow still felt. Sometimes they drew in the dust on the floor, a horse, a campfire, a river winding like a snake. He would respond with his own clumsy drawings, a crooked fence post or a windmill. They laughed at those not unkindly, and one of the older girls once drew a barn with smoke curling from its roof, then tapped her chest and looked at him, as if to say, "This is where we are now." Little by little, pieces of their story slipped through the cracks. A gesture mimicking arrows flying, a shadow passing over their faces at the mention of another place far to the south. He began to suspect they were running from something not just dangerous, but personal, something like a raid or a betrayal. There was a heaviness in the way the oldest sometimes sat apart, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though expecting it to open and spill trouble across the land. He didn't tell them his story outright, but in the quiet hours, it came through in fragments. A tin-framed photograph on the shelf that he never touched. The way he paused when he passed the empty rocking chair on the porch. Once, while mending a saddle strap by the fire, he said something without thinking, half to himself, about how his wife used to hum when she cooked. The words didn't mean much to them, but the ache behind them did. The days lengthened into a rhythm neither of them had planned. They worked side by side when work was to be done. They gave each other space when it was not. Once, a calf fell sick, and he was ready to write it off as lost, but the girls wouldn't have it. They brought water in small pails, coaxed the animal to stand, rubbed its flanks to keep it warm. He joined in, surprised at how determined they were. By morning, the calf was on its feet again, and when it took its first wobbly step toward its mother, the barn filled with a sudden burst of laughter. The sound startled him. It had been so long since such a sound had lived here. It stayed with him long after the moment passed, lingering in the corners of the room like a warm draft. Still, not everything was as it seemed. There were moments when their eyes flicked toward the horizon without warning, or when a noise outside would stiffen their shoulders. He began to catch himself doing the same. It was one of those evenings, after a long day of hauling water and cutting wood, that he saw it. The sun was dropping behind the far ridge, the sky burning orange at the edges and fading to purple above. He stood by the fence line, idly watching the light spill across the land. Then he noticed movement, small shapes riding the crest of a distant hill. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know they weren't stray cattle. Riders. They moved in a slow, deliberate line, silhouettes black against the dying light. He counted 3, then lost track when they dipped behind her eyes. The prairie swallowed them whole, but the unease they left behind stayed. He stood there a long while, the cold air tightening around him, before finally turning back toward the cabin. Inside, the firelight flickered on the girls' faces as they spoke in low tones. They didn't notice him at first, but when they did, he thought he saw a question in their eyes, one they didn't need words to ask. He didn't answer it. Not yet. But the uneasy truth sat heavy between them, like the weight of a storm still hiding beyond the horizon. The sky had been clear that morning, but by late afternoon the west had grown heavy with clouds. Thunderheads rose like mountains in the distance, their gray bellies dragging shadows over the prairie. The wind carried a strange smell with it, wet earth mixed with something sharper, something that didn't belong. He watched those clouds a long while from the fence line, the dog restless at his heels. It was the tracks he saw first. Down near the river, in a patch of damp soil, the marks were fresh. Horse tracks, more than one animal, the prints deep from a steady, unhurried walk. Whoever they belonged to hadn't been in a hurry. They had passed through knowing exactly where they were and where they were going. He knelt, tracing the edge of one print with a calloused finger, feeling the sharp edge where the hoof had cut into the mud. That night, after the cattle had been brought in and the barn door pulled tight, the wind shifted. It came from the north, carrying a sound so faint at first he thought he'd imagined it. Then it grew, a low and steady rhythm, distant drumming. It rolled across the land like a heartbeat, deep enough to feel in the chest. The girls heard it too. He saw their faces turn toward the dark beyond the barn walls, saw the quick, silent glances they exchanged. They didn't speak, but the air between them seemed to tighten. The next day, the truth began to take shape. It came not in a single conversation, but in pieces, carried through broken words, gestures, and the kind of silences that say more than speech. He had been sitting by the fire, mending a split in the bridle, when the oldest knelt across from him. She tapped her chest, then made a sweeping motion toward the horizon, a gesture he had come to recognize as her people, her home. Then she mimed a circle, pressing her fingers together tight, and shook her head. Another girl, younger, lifted her hand as though gripping a bough, then pointed sharply to the ground between them. It took time, but the meaning sank in. They were daughters of warriors, men from rival bands, enemies by tradition. Something had bound them together against that tradition, and in doing so, had defied the will of leaders who prized the old ways above all else. Their presence here was not a matter of accident. It was a statement, whether they had meant it or not. The knowledge settled heavy in his stomach. It explained the tension in their eyes, the way they watched the horizon as though expecting it to move. It explained the distant riders he had seen days before. It explained the drumming. For the first time, he thought of telling them to go. He could take them partway, leave them near the river, give them food and blankets. Maybe they'd find their own way before trouble arrived at his door. The thought stayed with him all through the afternoon. But every time he looked toward the barn and saw one of them moving inside, stooping to brush a horse bent over the fire pit, passing a bowl to another, something in him pushed back. He remembered the night they arrived, the way they had stood at his fence line without a word, the dust clinging to their skirts, the oldest pointing to the barn. He remembered the youngest's quick glance up at him before she hurried inside. He remembered that fierce dignity in their eyes, the kind you don't see often in people who've lost their footing in the world. By evening, the decision was made. They would stay. He began to prepare. The barn doors were reinforced with heavy crossbeams. The cabin windows were shuttered tight and barred from within. Water barrels were filled and set by the door. He took stock of the food, sacks of flour, a few sides of smoked meat, jars of beans, and pickled vegetables, and moved some into the barn so the girls wouldn't have to cross open ground if trouble came. The work kept his hands busy, but the nights carried something else, quiet moments that weren't work at all. On clear evenings, they would sit outside, the stars sharp above them, their breath fogging in the cold. Words came slowly, stitched together from what little language they shared, but they didn't need much. Sometimes they would just sit, listening to the wind in the grass. Once, one of the girls brought out a small drum no bigger than a plate, and played so softly it felt more like a whisper than a song. The sound seemed to fold into the land, as though it had always been there. The bond between them had become something unspoken but strong. He could see it in the way they moved around each other now, how one would hand him a tool without being asked, or how they left a portion of food on the table for him if he was late. He found himself watching the barn at night, not out of suspicion, but with a quiet certainty that he had something worth guarding again. It was just before dawn when the shape of the horizon changed. The light was pale and gray, the kind that comes just before the sun tips over the edge of the world. He stepped outside, pulling his coat tighter, and froze. From the ridge to the east, a dark line moved. Riders, so many they blurred together. Not 7, not 70, but hundreds. The sound of their horses carried faintly across the frozen air, a deep and rolling murmur. He stood there a long moment, his breath clouding in the cold, the dog pressed close to his leg. Inside the barn, he could hear the girls stirring, unaware of what was coming. The line of riders grew clearer with each step of their mounts, the first glint of metal flashing in the early light. The prairie was no longer empty, and whatever storm he had let into his life that night by opening the barn door had just arrived in full. The sun hung low over the land, bleeding red into the rolling earth until sky and soil seemed to share the same fire. The ranch stood alone in that vastness, a lone sentinel against the dying light. The boards of the barn glowed like embers, the wind carrying the dry scent of dust and hay. 7 girls stood in its doorway, their faces half-shadowed, eyes fixed on the horizon. In the yard, the rancher stood with his hat in his hand, the brim twisting slowly between his fingers. His shoulders were square, but there was a weight in them, a stillness that spoke of knowing the shape of danger long before it arrived. It came first as a tremor beneath the soles of his boots, faint, uncertain, but growing. Then the sound swelled, rolling across the plains like the first growl of a storm. Hoofbeats, hundreds of them, pounding in rhythm, as though the earth itself had taken on a heartbeat. The air began to vibrate with it, each thud of hoof on hard ground sending a shiver up the wood of the porch and into the bones of the house. Out of the heat haze they emerged, riders in full regalia, their horses restless, nostrils flaring. Faces were painted in patterns that caught the light, some like the wings of birds, others like the stripes of predators. Spears and lances glinted as they shifted in the saddle, catching the last shards of sun before night swallowed them. They formed a wide, unbroken circle around the ranch, horses stamping, leather creaking, the occasional snort cutting through the quiet. Dust rose and hung in the air, blurring the horizon, turning the red light of dusk into something deeper, something almost blood-colored. It was a scene older than fences, older than law, the kind where a man's fate could turn on the strength of a single breath. From the ranks of riders, a figure separated himself. The war chief. He moved forward at a measured pace, his horse stepping high, head tossing as if it felt the gravity of its rider's intent. The chief's eyes locked on the rancher, steady and unblinking, carrying neither rage nor mercy, only the weight of judgment. The rancher did not step back. He did not raise his voice, for this was not a moment for shouting across the wind. The world seemed to hold its breath, even the horses quieting, as the chief reined in a few paces from him. They spoke in the still air, not in shared language, but in shared understanding. The rancher's words were plain, but his meaning was clear, pointing to the girls behind him, to the hearth where the fire burned, to the open sky that belonged to them all. He did not bargain with fear or plead for pity. He stood as a man who had made his choice long before this moment, one who understood that a home was not made of timber and nails, but of those you swore to shelter within it. For a long time, the chief said nothing. His gaze shifted past the rancher to the faces in the barn doorway. And then, in the hush, one of the girls stepped forward. Her small boots kicked dust as she moved, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted. She spoke, her voice carrying words the rancher did not know, but the tone was unmistakable. Steady, clear, unafraid. The air thickened with silence, every eye fixed on her. She did not flinch, even when the chief's gaze settled on her fully. The stillness stretched on, the red sun now barely clinging to the edge of the world. Then, without warning, the chief swung down from his horse. His boots met the ground with the sound of dust shifting under weight. He crossed the space between them slowly, the distance between threat and understanding narrowing with each step. When he reached the rancher, he did not speak. He simply extended his hand and placed something in the rancher's palm, a small carved token, its edges worn smooth by time and handling. It was a gesture older than written treaties, a symbol that said what words could not. Peace, for now, had been chosen. The chief turned without ceremony, mounted his horse in one smooth motion, and wheeled it around. At some unspoken signal, the circle broke apart. Warriors guided their mounts away, one after another, until the yard stood empty except for the slow settling dust. The hoofbeats faded into the horizon, swallowed by distance and dusk. In the silence that followed, the girls did not rush forward. They stood where they were, tears glinting in a last light, caught between the fear of what had almost happened and the relief of what had not. Night came quickly on the plains, bringing with it a chill that seemed sharper after the heat of the day. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting its gold and amber light across the worn floorboards. The girls lay curled on blankets near the warmth, the lines of worry smoothed from their faces in sleep. Outside, the wind whispered across the grass, carrying the scent of distant smoke from campfires beyond the reach of sight. The rancher sat in his chair by the fire, the token resting in his palm. He turned it over slowly, feeling the ridges and grooves carved into it. The dog lay curled at his feet, tail flicking in quiet dreams. He watched the firelight play against the sleeping faces of the girls, each one now part of a story he had not expected to be his own. In that stillness, a truth settled over him with the weight of something undeniable. For the first time in years, he was not alone. The emptiness he had carried like an old injury was gone, replaced by the quiet certainty that he belonged here, not because of the land or the house or the blood in his veins, but because of the people under his roof. Home, he realized, was not a place you built to keep the world out. It was the people you opened it to, the ones you chose to protect when the world told you to shut your door. That night, with the fire steady and the sound of breathing all around him, he understood that the bravest thing a man could do was not to stand against the storm, but to stand for those who could not stand for themselves, even when it meant facing the storm head-on. And in that quiet, he knew he would make the same choice again, no matter the cost.